Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversants are Mary Harrington and Alex Kaschuta. Mary Harrington is an author, and Alex Kaschuta is a mother-to-be and very active online, and they're both involved in this nascent movement. I guess it's not a movement, it's a proposition called Reactionary Feminism. And the basic supposition is that liberal feminism and liberalism don't actually do much for women in general. They just benefit the upper crust of society, but not women in general, because of its conception of the liberal subject as unbeholden to the realities of birth and death and caregiving. Fascinating conversation. Some edgy ideas, I think is fair to say, but I thoroughly enjoy their company and their arguments and their minds. So without further ado, here is Mary Harrington and Alex Kaschuta.
So it's not really very lib-fem. I mean, it's feminist, but it's not liberal.
Is it like the classical feminism, aka classical liberalism feminism? Is that what it is? No.
No. My argument is that we need to can that, because we no longer live in an age where it's possible or workable or particularly useful. In fact, it is my view that that whole paradigm is now working against the interests of women.
The liberation paradigm.
Yeah. The pursuit of liberation is now actively inimical to the interests of women, with the exception of a very small elite who can externalize the downsides. Mm-hmm. You know, they can rent the womb of a poor woman in a developing country. They can buy in staff to mitigate the effects of atomization. You know, they can freedom's mostly upsides if you're rich enough. But for everybody else, it's arguably. It's even Stevens, if not actually really not that great. Okay,
so are you reassessing what it is to be bounded or to be unliberated, I guess, or responsible?
Well, I mean,
what is the opposite of liberty?
I mean, the core of my thesis is that the liberal subject as such. I mean, this isn't an original thesis of mine, but it's an insight that's been pointed out by a number of contemporary women, that the liberal subject as such is always in tension with the experience of being female, or at least it certainly is at the point where you start having children. You know, you can't the sort of classic liberal, you know, self-directing, autonomous, you know, unrelational, atomized subject. Mm-hmm. You know, the self-directing individual is a very masculine idea, because it has no way of accounting for states of dependency or for relationships of care.
Okay.
And you know, Rousseau talked about how, you know, dependency engenders all the vices. And in his liberal vision for, you know, educating the ideal liberal subject, he just excluded women from the get-go. He was like, women should be raised to be compliant, amiable, pleasant, relatively undereducated sport humans. And in a sense, you know, I mean, it's provocative to say it, but in a sense, from where he was standing, he was kind of right. Because if you're going to have one set of people who are entirely kind of autonomous and self-directing, you kind of need a second subclass of support humans who are going to wipe the bottoms and, mm-hmm. you know, clean up and do the washing up. It doesn't work otherwise.
Are you arguing in that direction? And are you trying to recreate what it means to be subhuman from that point of view?
Not really. I mean, it's to be clear, it is not my contention that women should go back to assuming that role. You know, that's not where we are. And I certainly have no desire to inhabit that role. You know,
well, it's too late now, it seems like.
Right, exactly. I mean, even if I did want women to get back to the kitchen, which I do not, the genie is well and truly out of the bottle. But somebody still has to wipe bottoms, and the liberal subject, which is now the pursuit of everybody, men and women. You know, this ideal state of liberated autonomy that has no way of accounting for symbiosis or dependence or care or old age or illness or any of that stuff, except reality. As something. reality. The reality. There's no so everybody is now pursuing that ideal, and nobody's doing the looking after, or increasingly the looking after is it's shunted off onto people who are sort of automatically treated as second class, whether that's migrants or people of color or working classes, or pretty much automatically the moment you start doing an occupation which is oriented towards care, you're treated as second class. And that's actually baked into the liberal paradigm.
Okay, so are you forging a paradigm where that is there's equality in the view of what that class relationship is, or something?
No, I'm saying we should detonate freedom as an ideal for everybody to aspire to. If it's going to screw a subset of the population, regardless of how we structure it, then we should just bin it and think of a more healthy and holistic way of organising ourselves that actually takes account of care. Hello, Alex. Nice to see you.
Hey.
Hey guys. We got stuck in.
So just to recap, Alex, we're talking about, I guess, reactionary feminism. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, of course.
Is it a thing now, Alex? Have we memed it into existence yet?
I hope so. I mean, Mary is definitely the meme warrior number one. She is the origin of the meme, and yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very worthy meme. I'm glad to participate in it.
So, Alex, you would be on board with this, or you have a conception of this that would be positive, you think, for women and men, assumably, humankind?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what does that entail? What are you on board with?
What am I on board with? Well, I think, I mean, this is your concept, Mary. You are the founder of the meme, but as far as I understand it, it's a conception of feminism that is rooted in reality, in the sense of biological differences. It's also something that doesn't bake in the idea of progress, so it has no eschatological end goal. We're not all riding towards some horizon line where equality will be upon us finally. So I think it's just a realistic assessment of how we can live together and how we can help women in that context as well, because there are many ways in which this egalitarian feminism that we're now subjected to, it's not very good for women. And I think one of the projects of reactionary feminism would be to expose those ways, in the many ways that's the case, and maybe find better ways of living together and thriving for both sexes.
And this is, Mary was talking about how this is embedded in reality insofar as we have to take care of each other. And the liberal conception of ultimate freedom is screwing around with the reality of us needing to be interdependent. Women, slightly more so, well, not slightly, women are dependent on the biological cycle of giving birth and then all that happens ensuing from having a child. Right. So is reactionary feminism trying to recreate the subject of the woman and the man or the family? What's the context? What's the building block of this?
I suppose for me, it started from the fact that, having a child for me was just a straightforward, it trashed my liberalism. I lost my faith in the liberal subject in the course of experiencing gestation and childbirth and everything that followed from that. I mean, Alex, you're kind of closer to the coalface on this than me, as you're about to have a baby. But we're kind of just on opposite sides of that two-way mirror, and it completely rewrote my consciousness in a way which is very difficult to describe. But it's a process, like having a baby is like watching one of your own limbs detach and be physically separate from you, but it still feels like a part of your own body, and you still feel this visceral need to take care of it like you would take care of a part of your own body. I mean, you don't resent the time you devote to making sure that your legs don't develop hideous injuries, right? And it's as automatic and unreflecting devotion as that in the normal course of things, or certainly that was my experience of it. And there is nothing within the liberal anthropology that accounts for that. In fact, the idea that you might be sort of symbiotically merged with another person is treated as pathological, in fact. I mean, if you You see this in the sort of psychological theories that talk about, unhealthy codependence, and I'm sure there are some codependencies which can be unhealthy, but the interdependence and the state of mergedness of a mother with a new baby is not one of them. It's natural and it's normal and it's healthy and it's actually, it's evolutionary, it's biological, it's necessary, it's adaptive. To borrow language from evolution, if you don't love and care for and fiercely feel devoted to your child, then your child will die.
Would it be fair to posit that liberalism creates resentment insofar as it expects us to be independent, and then when we are suddenly dependent through childbirth, then there's all that resentment there because the reality is impeding on our version of self?
Well, I think there's definitely a kind of, there's a real tension between the self that you're supposed to be as to be a functioning liberal subject, whether you're a man or a woman, within the terms of what it's like to be a person in the modern world, which is to say self-directing. You should be oriented towards career, and you should be a consumer. You should be all of these. You should be relatively self-contained. You shouldn't have to rely too much on other people. Yada yada yada. That whole paradigm of what a functioning late consumer capitalist adult looks like. And there's a real tension between, what you have to do in order to tick all of those boxes and what it feels and what you want to do when you've just had a baby. And looked at from the other side. I am getting around to answering your question. Trust me, I'm getting there. I just had a conversation earlier today with somebody who's with a pregnant woman, a friend, who was saying, who was sort of worried about, am I going to absolutely hate not having any time to myself anymore? And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, well, there were definitely times when I chafed when I was a new mother, but most of the time, actually, a lot less than I expected, because there's this sort of visceral state of symbiosis which is just not accounted for. There's no stories really told about it, within the whole framework of being a functioning, autonomous, atomized, late consumer capitalist adult. There's just no way. It doesn't compute. They're two radically different states of consciousness. And I think because of this, it's a lot harder for women who've drunk the Kool-Aid, who've drunk the sort of atomization Kool-Aid, to make the transition. From paraphrasing a friend of mine who is a breastfeeding consultant and NCT, the National Childbirth Trust teacher of sort of mothercraft to new mums, she says, without fail, it's the women who tell themselves, oh, I'm not going to change at all after I have a child. Those are the ones who get postpartum depression. Absolutely, without fail. It's a solid predictor. Because people, that those are the ones who've drunk the atomization Kool-Aid. Those are the ones who think that actually it's possible to be a liberal subject and also a good enough mother. And it's not true. You just can't do it.
Alex, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I'm slowly merging into this state of being that Mary is describing so accurately, and
just for the people at home, you're a few weeks away from child
days,
having.
Maybe. I look like I'm about to explode any second. So yeah, I'm definitely very much in the grips of a very illiberal state of being. I'm chained to nature as we speak, and it's quite freeing in many ways, in the sense that it does kind of knock you out of your illusions of being completely autonomous and free and a rational subject like Mary was describing. I haven't had the experience of being a mother yet, but I can kind of intuit it, and I definitely don't expect not having to change, because I've already changed significantly. Yeah, to me, this is kind of a journey I've been on, a very similar one to Mary, and I also have deep doubts about liberalism's focus on this one perspective, because this is a necessary perspective. It's a truly miraculous perspective, the perspective of the rational autonomous agent. And if you look at science and the miracles of the 21st century, you see that it is a valuable perspective. it's not the only perspective, and it's not sufficient to build your whole civilization on, because if we look back at the 21st century, the same type of mindset also gave birth to the most atrocious ethical horrors, in the idea that we could, the way we've done scientific improvement, we're just going to take that mindset and apply it to ethics. And with ethics, we're just going to ride off into the sunset and create the new man, be it the fascist individual, or be it the communist subject. There's always some improvement on the horizon. Sorry, I'm about to breath because my lung capacity is quite low now. Yeah, I think that's kind of the direction I've been going in as well, and I think that overlaps pretty well with what Mary was describing.
Is there a step towards making those two things understand each other? Liberalism and I don't even know what to call this. It's not reactionary. It's realistic from your point of view. So this the state of enmeshedness and the state of atomization, is there a crossover, or do you just have to flip your viewpoint? Do they merge? Can they merge? Mary, you said offhandedly, just smash the whole thing.
Well, I was talking. What was I saying? We should detonate. I was saying we should detonate. No. Let me soften that very slightly. I don't completely mean let's burn liberalism to the ground and salt the ashes, but I mean maybe I slightly mean that. But I'm sort of gesturing in that direction, but I'm not completely going to go there. What I will say is we need to complicate and soften the paradigm of freedom. Which is something, that over the last couple of centuries, to a sort of ever decreasing degree, that complication and that softening was mostly done by the Christian faith. But people, like we now live in a post-Christian society. People just don't really believe in, being a Christian is very much a minority thing now. And so, in as much as we ever really had any guardrails against the pursuit of absolute freedom, they're kind of gone. Pretty much the only place to stand, if you want to critique freedom, from within a kind of well worked out theory of how to do things differently, is probably Catholic social teaching. I'm not a Catholic, but it's not a coincidence that so many people who describe themselves as post-liberals, which to me is just reactionaries who don't inhale. It's no coincidence that a lot of those guys are Catholics, because it's a functional place to stand. If you want to critique the idea of sort of freedom as a kind of freedom and progress as sort of absolutes that we're eternally progressing towards, I don't think when I say I don't believe in progress, I don't mean I don't think things ever change, but I do think I do question the idea that we're intrinsically necessarily by definition improving all the time, and that change is always for the better. I think changes invariably come with trade-offs, and I just don't believe that the human species is in some absolute sense better now than we were 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago even. I don't buy that. I don't see how you can do it without defining your terms. And the moment you've defined your terms, you've begged the question. You've already skewed the answer in your favor, because if you follow.
When you bring up Catholicism, I just have an image of Joseph and Mary and baby Jesus. So is it that is the beginning unit then of this worldview, is the family? Is that father, mother, child unit rather than the individual? Or is there no units?
I mean, my not going to lie, my theology is I'm not a theologian. So I'm going to shy away from trying to give you chapter and verse on Catholic social teaching, but there's more of it's helpful as a way of softening the pursuit of freedom and progress, in as much as it makes space for the fallibility of humans. Like from that, it's a perspective from which it's not possible to create heaven on earth. It can't be done. Whereas, if you think about this sort of, what gets called providential liberalism now, this sort of theology of never-ending progress, you wouldn't pursue never-ending progress unless you believed it was somehow possible to achieve heaven on earth, right? Otherwise, what would be the point? And if you believe it's possible to perfect humanity on Earth, you'll go to pretty much any lengths in order to do that, which is how we end up at these 20th century atrocities like fascism and communism. They were efforts to create heaven on Earth. In a sort of
so was the civil rights
context.
movement, and so was the civil rights movement, and that
right. And there are
progress
reactionaries that think that should be abolished as well. I mean, I reserve judgment on that, but there are arguments afoot now that actually, the civil rights movement was a mistake. I mean, I'm not going to argue that case because I don't know it well, but it's out there.
Yeah.
But freedom in general is an eternal battlefield, because you kind of have this egalitarian creed that's baked into liberalism. In a way, we have to be, at least ethically on some level, post-Christianly equal in front of the law. But there are people in every society that benefit from freedom, in the sense that they directly benefit, that they have the freedom to achieve because they are high achievers. They're kind of above the bell curve middle in many ways, in ways that are rewarded by that society. And there are people who benefit from positive freedom, in the sense that they benefit from getting, from the state protecting them. So they would be people from on the other side of the bell curve. And this is going to be an eternal battlefield in any democracy. It's like, okay, because the people underneath the bell curve, they're many times they are there for no fault of their own, There are people who are shorter, they're not as good looking. They're not, there are many factors that go into this. And there's always going to be, half of the population, or whatever Pareto distribution you want to look at, that's going to benefit from maximum freedom, which is probably the people who will drift towards classical liberalism. And then you have people who are going to benefit from progressive liberalism that aims to equalize in other ways, which takes into consideration this idea that, people literally do not have equality of opportunity, just by sheer distributional force of where they're born, what assets they have at birth or even later. So, I mean, this is the friction at the middle of liberalism, and it is a millstone. And it's quite inescapable in many ways. You don't even have to complicate it that much. There's a dramatic political tension in there that's a bit irresolvable.
Is there a resolution for that within your conception of returning to a proto or supra-liberal state from this other point of view?
Yeah, I think there's, what Mary was highlighting as well, what makes integralism or, Catholic social teaching so interesting is that it's one of the few directions in politics that has a set, maybe it be the 10 Commandments, but they are set in stone. It makes moral claims that are not subject to reinterpretation. They're grounded in something solid. In this case, it's the Bible, or Catholic interpretations of the Bible, which is not the case when you have pure liberalism, which essentially bakes in the idea that there is constant progress, ethical progress, legal progress. Every year we discover a new way in which someone's been harmed, someone's been, prejudiced, or someone's gotten advantages that they didn't have coming to them. So I think the inescapability of a moral system, we have a moral system now, even if we just say, okay, we're in constant drift towards this, utopia, but there is a moral system, and the people who make the strongest moral claims now, people who are on the woke side, they tend to win out because they have a very powerful moral system. So I think my conception is that you either choose the moral system or it is imposed upon you by whoever has the strongest megaphone, or the strongest claim to oppression in this case, which liberalism is specifically vulnerable to because it believes in this idea of continuous progress.
Okay. Yeah, when you were talking about the bell curve, yeah. Mary, sorry.
Well, one of the reasons why this pursuit of continuous progress has come back to bite women is that if you're pursuing continuous progress towards some notional idea of equality, eventually you come up against inequities, if you like, which are baked into human sex dimorphism. So men and women are physiologically different. We're not that different. There's a huge amount of overlap, and the slowest men are slower than the average woman, right? There's a lot of overlap, but there are lots and lots of different axes on which, normatively speaking, there are physiological differences between the sexes. I mean, you can argue the toss about psychological differences, but even just focusing on the physiological ones, the differences are obvious, and most humans can be accurately sexed on sight as either male or female. So, and when it comes particularly to our reproductive role, some of those it's very difficult to iron some of those inequities out, right? There's only one half of the population that can gestate and breastfeed, and the moment you start applying this sort of top-down correction of inequities to the physiological inequities between male and female humans, you're suddenly in some really quite monstrous territory. Potentially, or territory where it's really very debatable whether or not actually what you're doing is in the interests of women. So, for example, trying to address the physiological inequity between men and women in the opportunity in the scope to gestate your own child by treating commercial surrogacy as a right for people who don't have uteruses, or, for example, treating transplants of uteruses from female into male bodies as a progressive cause, because that would correct another physiological inequity. Suddenly we found at the end of liberalism, we've found ourselves at a point where biotechnology and medicine has brought us to a state of, if you like, potentiality. In terms of what we can do, which has just blown out of the water a lot of the limits which were just there apparently naturally on what liberalism made it possible for us to achieve. And in that state of sort of tech enabled maximum freedom, some of the things we can now do to correct the inequities between the physiological inequities between male and female humans are just frankly terrifying for women. They reframe all humans as a kind of meat Lego that can just be remodeled at whim. It proposes to sever the bond, the natural, instinctive, biological bond between a mother and a newborn baby, in the interests of in the progressive interests of somebody else's civil right to have a child. You're suddenly in this phenomenally murky territory where there are women in developing countries now being treated as broodmares for people in the first world for women in the first world who've exercised their freedom to pursue their careers into their late 30s and have subsequently discovered that they're infertile. We're in territory where it's actually incredibly ambiguous as to whose justice are we correcting, whose inequities are we correcting, and it's my fear that at the sharp end of that we're going to find women, and particularly we're going to find mothers, because the bond, the motherhood and the experience, the physiological, the biological, the very animal experience of growing and birthing new humans and then caring for them, just is not and should not be subject to that kind of disaggregation and remodeling in the interests of some sort of utopian human perfection on Earth. I think it's profoundly wrong to try, and we're going to end up somewhere horrendous if we keep pursuing it. Well, so that is the core of my reactionary feminism.
Okay. You already see a version of that in the first world countries where schools in America are kind of allowing the children to change their gender at school and promoting this changing and liberalism of the authentic self of this child, and even taking the child away from the parents in certain circumstances if the parents don't go along with what the child wants. So the state is somehow maximizing the potential and tearing apart the family bond, because there's no family glue. There's just a bunch of individuals, right?
Yeah. There's just a bunch of individuals, and there's just a bunch of selves who are driving meat puppets. I think that's your phrase, Alex. The homunculus behind the eyes.
Yeah. He's got this machine.
Exactly. He's driving his meat puppet around, and of course, if it's a meat puppet, why shouldn't you remodel it like Lego? But when you apply this paradigm to children, you apply this idea of a fully formed, autonomous, self-defining subject to children. You find yourself suddenly again in some incredibly ambivalent, incredibly ambiguous territory in terms of whose justice, in fact, you're pursuing. I mean, I believe that there are numerous studies have shown, for example, that something like 80% of transgender identified children will eventually have their transgender identification resolve if they're left alone. If they're just sort of, with watchful waiting, around 80% of them will eventually resolve their cross-sex identification and become fairly, normally adjusted gay and lesbian adults. But if you socially and then medically transition those children, well, that almost never happens. And in fact, it's a pretty straight pathway from that to the full suite of medical interventions, which comes with osteoporosis, cognitive impairment, lifelong, some serious potential medical complications if you have the full sort of surgical interventions, throughout your body, and a life as a lifelong medical patient. Now, quite aside from the, in my view, deeply homophobic implications of turning what would otherwise be a normal gay or lesbian child, a proto-gay child, into a sort of sterilized simulacrum of a heterosexual person. Aside from the deeply homophobic implications of that, I just think it's profoundly wrong to treat children as though their identities are meaningfully stable, such that they can consent to, or it will be appropriate to, remodel their bodies in order to fit them. To me, that's just it's patent nonsense. I mean, I've been a teenager. I changed my hair color as often as I changed my underwear. I think this idea that you have some sort of stable state of selfhood as an adolescent is nuts. It's just nuts. And the only reason I can think of that it's happening is in order to sort of retrospectively legitimize their adult transgender identities by inventing this category of the trans child. I don't doubt for a moment that the children who have this cross-sex identification genuinely believe it at the time, but this idea that we should intervene medically in their bodies in order to correct the relation, the alignment between their performance of sex role stereotypes and their physiological presentation and their bodies, their natal sex, is nonsense. I mean, why shouldn't you be an effeminate boy or a tomboyish girl? What's wrong with that?
Yeah, and it does make a lot of sense. It's if you're someone who's kind of bought into this idea that there is the homunculus, there is a self-making self behind the eyes that makes the decisions, is rational, has an authentic core that it needs to live up to. Who says that this homunculus comes into action at 18? It doesn't really, even philosophically, it doesn't really make sense. It's like what's the difference between a 17-and-a-half-year-old and an 18-and-a-half-year-old? It's just a convention. A child, children can be kinky. We hear children can be sexual. Of course they can, in the sense, they have sexual impulses, they have puberty, they have all sorts of things happening to them. But at the same time, if you make the allowance that, okay, at 18, you're instantly the rational individual and whatever, go crazy, go nuts, go OnlyFans, whatever, you're empowered now. The idea that this, why wouldn't this happen earlier? Why shouldn't this child have rights? Because a lot of these things, are implied and they're couched in the language of rights. Because, you have the right to be authentic, to live your authentic self. Well, who says when authenticity enters the body? Could be at conception.
So the one problem with just the word reactionary is that it assumes that there's some sort of backward thinking. And you brought up homophobia, Mary. And if I could see a situation in which the family unit is the building block of a society, and that allows us to understand interdependency now, but then that determines an expectation that females should be mating with males and males should be mating with females, and then you have the establishment of another anti-homosexual kind of bent. So I'm just wondering.
To be clear, yeah. No, I see where you're going with that. To be clear, I am not personally hostile to same-sex relationships. I mean, I've been in plenty of them myself. Some of my, this is not something I personally object to. But I'm all for respectability politics. Regardless of the configuration of your relationship. I think if we're going to make interdependency in stable relationships, a central bulwark against radical atomization in society, then that has to go for same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples. So, what I mean by which I mean, I'm all for bourgeois monogamy. By all means, shack up with somebody who's the same sex as you, if that's your jam. I mean, some people are just wired that way, and I think it's just cruel and pointless trying to push back against that. But I'm all for bourgeois monogamy. This idea that we should all be, polymorphously perverse and fluid in our romantic and sexual contacts with other people. I'm deeply skeptical of. I'm all for bourgeois monogamy, and I think we should normalize that, and we should actively discourage other social norms.
Yeah, I think the question here is normalization. What does that mean? Does that mean, if something is not normalized, is it actively persecuted? Well, do we want to drive it off the face of the earth? And I think for any society, you have to have a norm that is pro-social. You have to have a norm. So the norm needs to be protected, and you protect the norm by stigmatizing other lifestyles. It doesn't have to be, political persecution and gulags and things like that, but there has to be a norm that, guarantees that there's going to be another generation. And if the norm is that, now everyone has 6 limbs and, you can pick your name and your new name is Wind Chime, and, the only purpose of your life from the perspective of the society is for you to inhabit this authentic self, then that society is not long for this world. So, just from the perspective of society, it might pay to have a norm, be it just, cohabitating or something, a baseline that is encouraged, and maybe also a bit slapped with stigma in some ways. Like maybe, no sex work for teenagers, that's
is it really so much to us?
Spicy, but yeah, things like that.
Call me crazy, but maybe not prostitution for teenagers. I don't think it's wildly unreasonable to say, by all means have same-sex relationships, but don't be promiscuous. Let's not encourage promiscuity because it's self-evidently bad for society. I don't think that's such a. I think that it's only a moderately reactionary thing to say.
Yeah, and the idea that you can't have same-sex relationships because it's not going to result in procreation directly. Like, okay, that feels like a step too far, but there probably should be some core nudging into the direction of procreation, because as we've seen, people definitely not nudged at the moment, and it's we're pretty much in the midst of a demographic collapse. So yeah something's got to give.
Yeah. Mary, I think I find it not ironic, but kind of wonderful in a way that you are now picking up so much traction you've kind of, you have a child, she's still young, but you're a mother, but at this point in your life, you're becoming more and more engaged with the world. It seems like you're coming into your own at a later time or in your own time, and you're showing that you can be a mother and you can be a self too. You can produce work in the world, right?
Of course.
And so I can see overreactionary tendencies to bind the woman from becoming herself, rather than understanding that a woman becoming a mother doesn't preclude her from, after that process, becoming a self again.
Yeah, it's a journey that every woman, every mother, I guess, has to pursue for themselves, which I sound incredibly kind of woolly and liberal. But what I mean by that is that different people find different relationships to that. There's been research done into it. The sociologist Catherine Hakim studied women's preferences under circumstances where actually, in the sort of, late consumer capitalist world, women actually genuinely do have a choice, post-liberal feminism, etc. We do genuinely have a choice, to a far greater degree than has been the case in the past about how we balance career and motherhood. Of course, there are economic pressures on that choice, but there's quite a lot of choice. And she found that something like 20% of women just want to stay home and be mothers, give or take. Something like 20% just want to do work. And a large subset of those will just not have kids, and some of them will have kids and just outsource the care of their kids. And the rest would prefer some kind of a balance. they maybe want to work 4 days a week, or they maybe want to work 3 days a week, or they want to like do, But if you live in a world where actually most of the domestic stuff, which used to be women, in an agrarian world, all the grinding stuff like, canning or weaving or spinning flax or all of that sort of manual labor, which was about turning the stuff of subsistence farming into actual products that your family can use. All of that gets done by machines and factories, right? So actually, most of the labor which used to be the kind which used to take up women's time just isn't there anymore. So why would we not work? But the challenge is finding a way of squaring that with actually having a kind of semi-functional family life. And for those of us who inhabit the Zoom classes, actually, the scope for that is now tremendous. Especially since the pandemic, and it's possible, for the Zoom classes at least, to work from home. The scope to balance, a very functional and well balanced family life with some engagement with the world is immense. I mean, I'm incredibly fortunate in that way, in that I do work from home, and I already did before everybody locked down. So I've kind of, it works really well for me. And I think for, if you have an occupation which takes you out of the home, that's a different equation. And of course, there's a class element to that, in the sense that, the further down the socioeconomic scale you go, the less likely you are to be in the Zoom classes, and the more likely you are to be, I don't know, driving a bus or, working in a care home or whatever. And there, the 20th century paradigm of, how on earth are you supposed to square childcare with work still applies. But I think, in the case of jobs like that, it's probably fair to say that, a large subset of those women would quite happily work less. And the whole idea that it's somehow a sacrifice to give up a chunk of your career is just absurd if your career comprises putting packets through a scanner in Sainsbury's so as not to get evicted from your apartment. I think it's again, the studies, the studies on this show that the number of women who desire to return back to work full time after a career break to have children is directly proportional to how much women earn. And I think it's obvious when you think about it. Why would you want to spend more time away from your child to put packets through a scanner in a supermarket? But if you've trained for 5 years into a very specialist branch of the law, and actually you really enjoy your job, why would you not want to go back to work? So depending on where you focus your lens, which it's very difficult to make universal pronouncements about what is or is not in women's interests. And I think one of the problems with the discourse that we currently have is that it's hyper-focused on the class interests of very much the kind of upper bougie end of women, whose interests have been universalized as the interests of women generally. And I think we really need to challenge that and say, no, actually, it's entirely reasonable for some women to demand to work less. And that actually that's a class issue as well.
So, at the end of the day, what makes this feminism? It's concern for women, and it's not a feminism that's liberating women. It's a feminism that's trying to speak for the range of female experience.
Yes, it's advocating for women as they are, rather than as they are filtered through this huge liberal lens that does tend to skew, like Mary said, towards the upper echelons rather than encompassing most women. Because a lot of the gains made by liberal feminism for the freedom of the upper class are essentially importing women from the lower classes to chaperone your children through their childhood, and to do all of the undesirable work that the upper class women have been freed from. So yeah, there's a lot of class redistribution of freedom, if I can put it that way.
And how have these ideas? What's the novel reaction to your reactionaryism that you guys have found in pronouncing this? What are some of the interesting critiques, pushbacks, or acceptance that you've gotten?
Yeah, I think the biggest question, at least for me, and in general, about what is if not liberalism, then what? Because the biggest fright of modern man is to make a moral claim. It's terrifying to say, okay, this is I have planted my stake in this moral territory, and I shall not budge. There is no progress to be made on this. That's anathema. So, I don't necessarily, I'm not coming with solutions, but I do see some glaring problems if this isn't done in some way or another, because it is being done currently. As I said, it's being done by, our so-called enemies, the people who are coming with very profound and very virulent moral stances, and they are claiming territory every day. So it's not like this. There is no moral ground. It's just being taken. So I think, that's to me, that's the biggest issue. I mean, the biggest and very correct pushback. Like, there is no grand unified theory of how we solve this. It's going to take some cojones.
The two most interesting pushbacks I get. Well, I mean, there's you get the one from the liberal side is, well, aren't you just saying that women should go back to the kitchen? Which I hope I've answered already. No. I mean, I could give you chapter and verse for another 20 minutes on how that stark split in how we work was an artifact of the industrial era, and we've now left the industrial era, and yada yada yada, or at least we're leaving it. But no, I don't think it makes sense to try and send women back to the kitchen, even if we wanted to go, which I personally do not. Because that's actually just not how people live their lives now, and it makes no sense to try and return to something which emerged from material conditions which, by and large, no longer obtain. So no, I'm not interested in sending women back to the kitchen. The other very interesting critique comes from the weird right, or at least one corner of the weird right, which is that that if in effect what we're arguing for is a new settlement, a new cooperative settlement between men and women in which both sexes get a freedom haircut. We both accept some new limitations, and we both accept a sense, a measure of interdependence and the necessity. And men, we need one another, and we've got to try and make this work. And one of the critiques that's now coming from the weird right against that is very much the. I'm not going to put any characters' names to it, but let's say the sort of vitalist end, let's all go and inhabit a roving pirate fleet and form manabunds to roam across the steppes, and let's slug eggs and lift weights and be men together. Like that end of the weird right sees what we're proposing as quote unquote a return to the longhouse, which is to say a grotesque attempt to recoup raw masculine energy for, a kind of revoltingly crippled, feminized sort of village humdrum existence. I hope I've done reasonable justice to that perspective in its own right. But I don't really have an answer to that except a kind of Nordic gamer yes, I guess.
So these men are afraid of getting gelded by this responsibility?
I think that's putting it very crudely, but it's something like that. It's something like, as an effort to, to modulate that sort of raw machismo with anything, least of all, the interests of women or, the pursuit of family life represents a sort of a grotesque, it represents a climb down, it represents a crippling or a hamstringing or some sort of gelding, I suppose. That it's emasculating and.
Yeah, that's always struck me as, a bit historically illiterate, because even in, the roving bands of males in the past, there were a handful of apex predators, the kingmakers, the people who went on conquests with their bros, while most people, and by that I mean the vast majority of people had quite stable lives, and they were probably some way associated with the longhouse, and those were the core of any civilization. So I do believe in great man theory, and I think the roving bandits should do it, but they would do it despite the baseline society. They would do it in spite of it, and in a way that's kind of their virtue. That isn't the Ubermensch rises above by definition, and so I don't think they need the architects of the longhouse to be involved in their plans anyway. They do whatever they want anyway. So I don't think that I don't know, that doesn't necessarily hold up. I think you need some way to sustainably continue your baseline civilization, and I think that involves some form of cooperation. Yeah, we can't all just be beating our chests and slogging egg whites, or maybe we can't. I don't know. Maybe that's the future, and I'm just not creative enough to imagine it.
No, I think, we've been sort of dancing around your sort of straightforward statement that, sacramental liberalism hates babies. I mean, that's very much my view. Sacramental liberalism hates babies. There's a deep fear. It's deeply antinatalist. And is inimical to the kind of conditions that make it easy or comfortable to have lots of babies. I mean, we see that in birth rates which are well below replacement across the developed world, right? But I think this sort of, the argument that we should get out of that by forming roving bands of pirate bros is equally antinatalist, actually. And if the idea is to try and get ourselves out of the impasse that we've got ourselves into, where actually the humans as a species have just sort of lost the will or the desire or the sort of comfortable capacity to carry on reproducing, at least in the West, which is to say we've become incapable of imagining a future, because that's really what not wanting to have children means. It means we can't envisage a future that we want to live in, or that we want to create. We can't envisage a future that we'd want to leave to our children. And it seems to me that the roving bands of pirate bros, haven't really escaped that paradigm, if they're not interested in babies either. I don't know, maybe they're just interested in setting fire to the ruins and dancing around and collecting. I don't know what it is they're interested in. I'm not those guys.
Well, what is the and Mary, we have to wrap up because you have child duties or mothering.
I do actually have to go and do bedtime shortly.
Well, one last question. It's probably a trick question, but what would reactionary feminism expect from men? Like, where do men fit in to this? What are we supposed to do? What do you want from us?
The eternal question.
What do women want? I mean, that's I can't speak for women in general. We're going to have to do a whole nother conversation about this. I mean, I think one of the difficulties in answering this is that we're starting from a very low baseline, in that one of the sort of direction of travel of feminism full stop over the last, say, 100 years has been rendering men obsolete. And there are very few honourable roles left in which, if you like, traditional masculinity has any kind of cachet or value whatsoever. There are once upon a time, those guys who are just really macho could go and join the army, or find a role which kind of enabled them to express that in a way which was socially useful. And there are very few of those roles left. And what we do to how we speak to that and how we address that, I think, is a very important and sensitive question, because it is my view that a measure of that masculinity is just baked into human sex dimorphism. It can be culturally inflected this way or that, but it's there and it's real. So, the answer, what do women, what would a reactionary feminism ask of men? I think I'd genuinely be interested in, what would men ask of a reactionary feminism? I would actually really want to turn it around, because I think there's a whole very unarticulated, very long and often very angry set of answers to that question, which we're going to have to work through before there's any sense in trying to make demands of the male sex, because there are a lot of voices there that just haven't been heard in a constructive way for a very long time. And that's not to say all of them are right, but but I still think that there's a lot there that needs to be heard.
That's a novel answer to that reactionary feminism would be open to men's input. You don't expect that from most feminisms.
Yeah, no, I think that's a central thesis of mine, is that we have to stop treating this as a zero-sum game. Always are screwed.
Yeah, and it is a zero-sum game if you start from the idea of the individual. It's always a contest of, how can I get mine? We kind of have to look at this as a marriage between not only two entities in a family unit, but between two categories of people at the level of society. That should be the level of abstraction that we need to focus on, and that requires male input, obviously, because it's a collaboration. And I think from my perspective, I'd expect men as well as women to understand sex differences. Either from a cultural perspective. We've got thousands of years of traditions talking about this stuff. You don't even have to dip into Evo Psych, pretty much the same stuff. But if you want to have a perspective that involves science, there's a lot of people talking about these sex differences from that perspective as well, and also kind of understanding the archetypes. It doesn't necessarily have to be like Jungian or anything, but just understanding how we can go through life together. Because a lot of liberal individualism focuses on the first, the most free part of your life is your youth. The young woman is kind of like this, this gleaming god of liberalism. It's like, okay, this is what everyone wants to be, but there are other steps in life. There are other steps in life for men as well. Men age as well. So it's kind of understanding each other in a holistic way, in a lifelong way, and how we can help each other at every stage, from maiden to crone, and that each stage has its own wisdom and its own social utility, and to bring back the social utility of the later life stages, because it is really desperate to not be free, because old age makes you unfree. And in a society that's obsessed with individual freedom, it's not surprising that people are completely panicked about getting older, or the relationships between men and women really decay because of factors of age and things like that. So I don't know, more understanding as liberal and wishy-washy as this sounds.
Well, Mary, respect your duties, and Alex, thank you for joining me, both of you. You guys are shining lights. You guys are doing really great work. And Alex, best wishes for the productivity of your body.
Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations for reaching the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed it, do be sure to leave a review or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever you need to do to show that glorious algorithm that this is some good stuff. And do be sure to go and check that back catalog, as it is brimming full of fantastic conversations. Links to provide monetary support are down there in the description as well. Have a good night.